The most shocking serial rapist in British history vertical bar, the story of Reynhard Sinaga. In a British residence in 2017, a horrifying incident unfolded that would shock the nation. Law enforcement officers, responding to an emergency call, arrived at the scene to find two young men, the homeowner and his visitor. One of them had become so violently aggressive that the other required immediate medical attention. The homeowner was in a critical condition, his face covered in bruises and lacerations, and doctors suspected both a concussion and internal bleeding. Medical professionals feared for his life. However, against all odds, the young man regained consciousness and was coherent enough to respond to police questioning. Both the medical team and the police initially assumed he was the victim. He clung to that narrative as best as he could. That is, until officers took a closer look at his mobile phone. What they discovered there was beyond anything they could have imagined. The photos and videos left them in utter disbelief. It became clear that the individual lying before them in such a pitiful state was far from innocent. In fact, he was one of the most prolific offenders in British criminal history. The man they were looking at was Reinhard Tambash Maruli Tuas Sinaga. Born on February 19, 1983, in Jambi, Indonesia, Sinaga grew up in a family of incredible wealth and privilege. His father was a highly successful real estate mogul and banker, owning one of Indonesia's largest banks and even controlling his own palm oil plantation. With this fortune, the Sinaga family lived in a grand mansion attended by numerous servants who catered to their every need. Reinhard, as a child, only had to lift a finger to get whatever he wanted. This kind of upbringing, where every whim was indulged, likely played a significant role in shaping his sense of entitlement later in life. Raised in a devout Catholic household, Reinhard's family attended church every Sunday without fail. Despite his affluent background, he was described as a sensitive, introverted child. He took comfort in reading books, playing musical instruments, and keeping to himself. He avoided trouble, preferring solitary activities over the pursuit of friendships. His reserved nature made him an easy target for school bullies, particularly because of his effeminate behavior. While he consistently performed well academically, placing at the top of his class throughout his school years, Reinhard lacked popularity among his peers. His love for the Spice Girls also subjected him to relentless teasing from other boys. According to studies on bullying, victims of such harassment are 2 to 9 times more likely to face mental health challenges later in life, a reality that Reinhard may have been deeply affected by. Upon completing high school in 2001, he took the next step in his academic journey, enrolling in Indonesia's leading public institution, determined to further his education and establish himself in a world that had already handed him so much. Little did anyone know the sinister path his future held. Reinhard enrolled in the University of Indonesia, where he pursued a degree in architecture. It was here that he truly came into his own, becoming a far cry from the shy, reserved teenager he had been in high school. He quickly gained popularity, standing out with his vibrant personality and sociability. Unlike before, he found it easy to connect with people and built numerous friendships. By the time he graduated in 2006, Reinhard had transformed into a confident and outgoing young man. Eager to continue his education, Reinhard decided to go abroad for further studies. His destination? The United States. Enrolled at a prestigious American institution, his journey seemed set for success. But within a few weeks of arriving, Reinhard grew disillusioned with the American college lifestyle. He told his father that his classmates were more interested in parties and socializing than studying. Feeling out of place, he packed his bags and returned to Indonesia. Despite the substantial investment his family made, prepaying tuition and accommodation fees, money was no concern for Reinhard. His family's vast wealth meant that financial loss didn't faze him in the slightest. However, Reinhard's ambitions didn't allow him to stay in Indonesia for long. His next move was to the United Kingdom, specifically Manchester, where the rest of this story unfolds. In August 2007, Reinhard arrived in the UK on a student visa and was accepted into the prestigious University of Manchester. Over the next few years, he earned not 1 but 2 master's degrees, first in urban planning in 2009 and then in sociology in 2011. During his time in Manchester, Reinhard fully embraced the student lifestyle, immersing himself in the social scene. He frequented nightclubs, formed new friendships, and lived a life of freedom. It was also during this period that Reinhard began to reflect on his sexuality. In his early years, he had often suppressed thoughts about his intimate preferences. Growing up in a conservative Catholic family in Indonesia, where homosexuality was not openly accepted, he never dared to express these feelings. However, in the more liberal environment of the UK, Reinhard allowed himself to explore these desires. He soon realized that he was more attracted to young men than women, a realization he had long suspected but could never openly admit while living in Indonesia. According to recent studies, it's not uncommon for LGBTQ plus individuals to suppress their sexual identity due to cultural or familial pressure. In fact, research shows that over 30% of LGBTQ plus individuals worldwide face challenges in coming out due to societal stigma. Reinhard, now far from the constraints of his home country, finally began to confront this aspect of his identity. In Manchester, Reinhard finally felt a sense of freedom. He could be himself, express his identity, and live openly without fear of judgment. He quickly developed a close-knit group of friends who shared similar interests. Together, they spent their evenings clubbing, socializing, and enjoying the carefree life of young students. Reinhard was open, friendly, and outgoing, and his passion for his studies never wavered. The vibrant student life he embraced wasn't cheap, but that was of no concern to Reinhard. His parents' wealth appeared boundless, and they generously provided him with all the financial support he needed. He thrived in his role as a perpetual student, enjoying the luxury of never having to worry about money. For Reinhard, there was no need to seek employment when his bank account was regularly replenished by his family. By 2011, Reinhard had turned 28 and decided to move out of student housing. He found a small apartment in Manchester's gay village, located near the heart of the city and just steps away from the bustling bars and nightclubs. His parents continued to cover his living expenses, so he had little to worry about financially. However, a new problem soon emerged. Reinhard was still in the UK on a student visa, and with his studies coming to an end, he faced the threat of deportation. To avoid this, in 2012, Reinhard enrolled in a postgraduate program at the University of Leeds. He began working on a dissertation in socioeconomic geography, which focused on the experiences of South Asian individuals of non-traditional sexual orientations living in Manchester. Although Reinhard was technically continuing his education, those around him noticed a shift in his behavior. Over time, Reinhard's personality began to change. Once known for his sociable and friendly demeanor, he became increasingly narcissistic and self-absorbed. His social media accounts were filled with self-aggrandizing posts, where he portrayed himself as a celebrity. As his self-obsession grew, he lost touch with his original circle of friends and instead surrounded himself with people he met at nightclubs, though these were more casual acquaintances than true companions. To maintain attention and remain the center of his social circle, Reinhard would often treat others to drinks and food. However, despite this generosity, he didn't form any deep or meaningful connections. Reinhard's outward appearance was always polished. He wore expensive designer clothing and loved to brag about his seemingly impressive bank account. When people questioned how he could afford such a lavish lifestyle, he fabricated stories. He falsely claimed to work for both Manchester United and Manchester City football clubs, hoping to impress those around him. According to a 2019 study on narcissistic behavior, individuals with an inflated sense of self-importance often seek external validation through material possessions and superficial relationships, traits Reinhard seemed to embody during this phase of his life. Reinhard became deeply consumed by his personal life, engaging in several relationships where his obsessive and possessive tendencies were on full display. When these romances ended, he would resort to emotional manipulation, often threatening self-harm to scare his partners into staying. Once alone, he would retreat to dating apps and social media, seeking validation and attention in the virtual world. His prolonged student life had become so all-consuming that he nearly forgot about his family. He only remembered his parents when his bank account ran low. At that point, he would call them, occasionally traveling back to Indonesia to top up his funds. Apart from these brief interactions, his family played little role in his life. With each visit home, Reinhard appeared different. His hairstyle, wardrobe, and even his mannerisms would change. His parents and siblings couldn't help but find his behavior odd, though they remained unaware of his biggest secret. Reynhard had never revealed his true romantic preferences to them. During these family visits, discussions about his future were inevitable. His parents, especially his mother, strongly urged him to return to Indonesia, join the family business, find a wife, and start a family. His mother was particularly insistent, going so far as to threaten to cut off his financial support if he didn't follow their wishes. Yet, Reynhard always found a way to persuade her of the necessity of staying in Manchester, buying himself more time in the UK. Despite his success in keeping his parents at bay, the strain of concealing his true identity began to take its toll. The psychological burden of living a double life led to increasing inner turmoil. By the end of 2014, after another trip to Indonesia where he had replenished his finances, Reynhard was now 31 years old. He had been a student for over a decade, seamlessly blending into the nightlife of Manchester without drawing much attention. According to a 2017 study on the psychological effects of living a double life, individuals who suppress their true identities for extended periods are prone to developing anxiety, depression, and feelings of isolation. Reynhard's reluctance to reveal his true self to his family likely contributed to these growing mental health challenges. While those around him might not have noticed the changes brewing beneath the surface, Reynhard's secret life was becoming more complicated and dangerous. There were no obvious signs that anything was amiss in Reynhard's behavior. It all seemed to happen in an instant, as though a switch had been flipped. In reality, however, it was anything but sudden. What happened next was the result of careful, premeditated planning. Reynhard had deliberately set out to attack another man. On New Year's Eve in 2015, a 22-year-old man was out celebrating with friends in Manchester, moving from one nightclub to another, enjoying the festivities. At some point, just before midnight, he approached the bar to order a drink, but after that, his memory went blank. Unbeknownst to him, Reynhard had slipped something into his cocktail. Taking full advantage of the man's incapacitated state, Reynhard brought him back to his apartment and violated him while he lay. The young man woke up the next morning on the floor of Reynhard's apartment, disoriented and covered in his own vomit. He had no memory of how he had ended up there. The last thing he could recall was ordering a drink the night before. Seeing Reynhard, the man asked what had happened, to which Reynhard quickly spun a fab. He told the young man that he had been too drunk to function and that, being the good guy he was, Reynhard had brought him back to his apartment to sleep it off. According to Reynhard's tale, the man had passed out as soon as they entered the apartment and had spent the night snoring on the floor. The young man, still confused, didn't question why. He assumed it was the after effects of drinking too much and even felt grateful that Reynhard hadn't left him on the street. He apologized for any trouble he might have caused, gathered his belongings, and left without realizing he had been a victim of a heinous crime. In reality, Reynhard had assaulted the man twice while he was unconscious, thought that he had been victim lawlessly. However, Reynhard didn't keep his act dead. He immediately bragged. He wrote about how, even though he didn't get his New Year's Eve kiss, he had his first intimate. He boasted that he had a straight guy at the bar. Woke up naked. The man had been initiated into another world. Reynhard's friends, believing the encounter had been consensual, they had no idea that Reynhard was actually bragging about assault. For Reynhard, the thrill advantage state was intoxicating. It wasn't just the act itself that driving. Just 4 weeks later, Reynhard struck again. This time, his target was a 21-year-old man who, like his previous victim, was out partying with friends at a nightclub in Manchester. After drinking a bit too much, the young man became an easy target. Reynhard persuaded him to come back to his apartment, where he once again slipped an illicit substance into the man's drink. The drug rendered him unconscious, and Reynhard took advantage of him several times while he was completely unaware. However, unlike the first incident, this time the victim began to wake up in the middle of the assault. Disoriented and frightened, he tried to escape, but his foggy mind and the weight of Reynhard on top of him made it impossible. Still heavily sedated by the tranquilizers, the man soon passed out again. The following morning unfolded in a similar way to the previous case. The young man, remembering nothing from the night before, apologized profusely to Reynhard for any inconvenience he might have caused and quickly left the apartment. At the time, Reynhard was sharing his apartment with an acquaintance. Growing tired of living alone, he had invited a friend to move in with him, though there was no close relationship between the two. It's likely that Reynhard's roommate had no idea about his true orientation or what was going on. The roommate noticed Reynhard coming home in the middle of the night with barely coherent strangers who were gone by morning, never to return. When the roommate began to suspect something was off, Reynhard simply kicked him out. With the apartment now fully at his disposal, nothing stood in the way of his predatory behavior. From this point on, the frequency of Reynhard's attacks escalated. His third victim was lured into his apartment just a week later, marking the beginning of a disturbing pattern. From that moment, it became a weekly occurrence, sometimes even more frequent. One or more young men would find themselves at Reynhard's mercy, unconscious and completely vulnerable every week. Each attack followed the same meticulous routine. Reynhard would sit by the window of his downtown apartment, strategically located near Manchester's nightlife hotspots, watching the bars and nightclubs below. From his vantage point, he could observe the city's late-night revelers paying close attention to the young men who had clearly drunk too much. They became his prime targets, and with each passing week, Reynhard's predatory behavior intensified. According to crime statistics, an alarming 80% of sexual assaults occur in situations where the victim knows the perpetrator or is lured into a vulnerable position. Reynhard's systematic approach to selecting his victims highlights the calculated nature of his offenses. He didn't just rely on chance, he carefully planned and executed his attacks, knowing exactly how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Their gait was unsteady and their movements exaggerated. Reynhard had a sharp eye for spotting young men who had wandered away from their groups. As soon as he identified a potential target, he would leave his apartment and approach the individual, striking up a conversation and pretending to be a concerned, helpful stranger. He played the role of a good Samaritan as though he genuinely cared about their well-being. "Are you okay? You seem lost. You've had a bit too much to drink. Why don't you come in and freshen up? Your phone is dead. I have a charger at my place. Where are your friends? You can wait for a taxi at my nearby apartment. It's freezing out here." These innocent-seeming phrases often marked the beginning of his attacks. Reynhard would choose whichever line was most fitting for the moment. Some needed a phone charger to contact their friends or order a taxi, while others just wanted water or a stronger drink. Some were simply freezing in the cold, waiting for a ride. Reynhard would approach these vulnerable individuals, his charm and friendliness putting them at ease. He exuded a warmth that made people trust him immediately, and most willingly agreed to accompany him back to his apartment. Once inside, the second phase of the attack would begin. Reynhard's victims all shared similar profiles. About 99% of them identified as heterosexual, a fact that Reynhard liked to brag about to his friends. He would boast about how he helped these men explore a side of themselves they didn't even know existed, implying that they might have enjoyed the experience. However, what he failed to mention to his friends was that these men were unconscious during the encounters. Most of his victims were quite young, the average age being 21, though the age range spanned from 17 to 36 years old. Many were students, which wasn't surprising given that Reynhard operated in an area close to the city's universities, bars, and clubs. His victims came from all walks of life and professions. There were cooks, personal trainers, military personnel, and even unemployed men. One thing they all had in common was their athletic, toned physiques and overall attractive appearance. Reynhard's apartment was typically messy, which helped his guests feel more at ease, assuming they were simply in the home of an ordinary guy. Clothes, personal items, and empty alcohol bottles were scattered around the place, creating a casual, unassuming atmosphere. Reynhard would invite his victims to relax on the couch, offering them a drink to help them unwind. In 9 out of 10 cases, the drink was alcoholic, and the men gladly accepted it, unaware that Reynhard had spiked it with a substance designed to strip them of their will. The substance Reynhard used was a colorless liquid, almost impossible to detect in a drink due to its faintly salty taste. While it could be noticeable in water by the time his victims consumed it, they were already too intoxicated to recognize the slight aftertaste. This drug had legitimate medical uses. It was commonly prescribed to treat conditions like narcolepsy. However, in the wrong hands, it became a dangerous disinhibitor, inducing feelings of euphoria, relaxation, and drowsiness. Within 10 minutes of ingestion, the substance began to lower inhibitions, putting the victims in a vulnerable state. In higher doses, it could cause complete unconsciousness, leaving the individual with no memory of what had occurred. While the effects could last for several hours, the drug metabolized and exited the body so rapidly that detecting it after the fact was nearly impossible. This substance had gained notoriety as a tool for incapacitating unsuspecting victims. In the UK, possessing even a small amount could lead to serious legal consequences, including prison time. However, Reynhard somehow managed to secure a large supply and used it regularly on his unknowing guests. Once the drug began to take hold, Reynhard moved to the next phase of his plan. He needed to be sure that the substance had fully taken effect, so he would ask his victims various questions, observing how their ability to think and respond deteriorated. As their minds fogged and speech became slurred, it was clear the drug was doing its job. Reynhard's inquiries were often simple, personal questions, asked under the guise of politeness, yet his true intention was to gauge how quickly their consciousness was fading. In addition to the physical control he exerted over his victims, Reynhard had another disturbing habit. He liked to collect trophies. These could be anything from ID cards to clothing, credit cards, or even small personal items. The nature of the item didn't matter. What mattered to Reynhard was keeping a memento of his conquest. He would store these trophies in a box under his bed, a private collection from his series of assaults. As the conversation dragged on, the victims would inevitably start to lose consciousness, becoming drowsy and unable to stay awake entirely at Reynhard's mercy. At this stage, Reynhard would prepare 2 cameras. He set one on his phone atop the dresser to capture the entire assault from a distance, while holding a second camera in his hand for close-up footage. He meticulously recorded the victim's face, unclothed body, and intimate areas, creating hours-long videos of his crimes to watch later. Some of these recordings went on for hours, mirroring the duration of the assaults. In one particularly disturbing case, a single video lasted 8 hours, during which the victim never regained consciousness, and Reynhard continued his violations without interruption. Reynhard never felt the need to hurry. His sense of impunity was strong. The assaults followed the same disturbing pattern. He was always aggressive, and some of his victims became ill during the attack. Bodies reacted differently to the substance Reynhard had given them. Some experienced internal bleeding or other adverse reactions, but even this didn't stop him. Every moment was captured on video from multiple angles, with Reynhard adjusting the lighting to ensure nothing was missed. Occasionally, some victims would briefly regain consciousness and attempt to flee, but their disoriented minds and drugged bodies made it impossible. Others tried to fight back, but their movements were weak, uncoordinated, and no match for Reynhard's control. He knew that while the drug was still in their system, they were entirely at his mercy. By the next day, most of the victims couldn't remember anything. They woke up in Reynhard's apartment, unsure of how they had gotten there. Some felt embarrassed by their disorientation, often apologizing for their behavior before hurriedly leaving. Others sensed that something was terribly wrong but couldn't quite grasp what had happened. For a few, the drug's lingering effects left them temporarily unable to move, terrifying them further, though they had no idea just how much worse the night had been. This lack of memory and confusion is precisely why Reynhard got away with his actions for so long. Each man who ended up in his apartment had a different vague recollection of events, but they all shared one common memory: drinking at a stranger's house and blacking out. The next morning, Reynhard would tell each victim the same story, that they had simply drunk too much and passed out. His demeanor was always the same, charming, with a wide, friendly smile. He seemed harmless, so no one ever suspected him. Even if some of them had their doubts later, none ever went to the police. Most were too embarrassed or ashamed to talk about it and preferred to put the entire night behind them. Reynhard Sinaga's predatory behavior continued, and his number of victims steadily grew: 10, 20, 30, eventually climbing to over 100. To this day, the true number of his victims remains unknown. Reynhard's youthful appearance played a significant role in enabling his crimes against unsuspecting men. Despite being over 30, he looked much younger, easily passing for a harmless student. His natural charisma and polite demeanor allowed him to quickly gain the trust of those he encountered. His short stature and slim build also made him appear non-threatening, especially to intoxicated individuals. But as with all dark schemes, his reign of terror was bound to end. One night, a 21-year-old man named Michael was out partying with friends in Manchester. Around 4 a.m, he realized he had lost his group in the crowd. When he reached for his phone, he found it had died. Desperate to reconnect with his friends, Michael stepped into a takeaway food shop and asked if anyone had a phone charger. This is when Reynhard appeared, offering to let him charge his phone at his nearby apartment. Although Michael found it strange that Reynhard seemed completely sober at that hour, he didn't sense any immediate danger. Reynhard's friendly appearance and calm demeanor put him at ease, so he agreed to go to the apartment to charge his phone. However, once there, Michael declined Reynhard's offer of a drink. An unusual situation for Reynhard, as most of his previous victims had accepted some kind of beverage. Thrown off by this unexpected refusal, Reynhard became visibly flustered, unsure of how to proceed. In an attempt to regain control of the situation, he awkwardly suggested that Michael must be tired and should rest on the couch. But this odd behavior only confused Michael further. Trusting his instincts, Michael decided to take his half-charged phone and leave the apartment, finding Reynhard's actions increasingly suspicious. Little did Michael know he had narrowly escaped becoming the latest victim of one of the most prolific offenders in British history. Had it not been for his intuition, he might have fallen prey to Reynhard's twist game. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you found this video interesting. It helps a lot. The assaults continued for 2 more years, from 2015 to 2017, as Reynhard preyed on men who were oblivious to the danger lurking behind his pleasant. By night, Reynhard prowled Manchester's streets, preying on unsuspecting men, but by day, he led a seemingly ordinary life. He was still technically a graduate student, supposedly working on his doctoral dissertation. However, in 2016, his work was harshly criticized because it was centered on himself, essentially a self-written biography. As a result, Reynhard was forced to revise the paper entirely, but to him, it was just another excuse to avoid returning to Indonesia. Reynhard remained highly active on social media, posting short videos on TikTok and staying engaged in his WhatsApp group, where he continued to boast about his exploits. He often joked about saving guys from their clingy girlfriends, presenting himself as some kind of hero in these twisted scenarios. In 2017, Reynhard's confidence escalated into carelessness. More and more of his victims began waking up at the worst moments. But he was so exhilarated by the thrill of his attacks that he continued, seemingly unconcerned about whether anyone would remember. His crimes became even more brazen, and at one point his actions escalated to outright abduction. Reynhard meticulously documented his assaults, storing countless videos on external hard drives. Some of the footage remained on his phones, and he liked to keep track of his victims' lives on social media. But in 2017, one of his victims began to piece together. After waking up in a daze, the man realized that he had been assaulted by Reynhard and went to the police to report it. However, due to the lingering effects of the tranquilizers Reynhard used, the man couldn't remember key details. He couldn't recall the location of the apartment or even describe his attacker accurately. Although detectives extracted DNA evidence from the victim's body, as Reynhard never used contraceptives, there were no matches in the police database. Reynhard had never been on law enforcement's radar, so his DNA wasn't on file. Then, on June 1st, 2017, the unexpected happened. An 18-year-old named Peter was out celebrating the end of his graduation exams with his friend. Peter, an athletic young man who played rugby at school, fit the profile of the types of victims Reynhard favored. That night, Peter and his friends were drinking at a nightclub located just steps away from Reynhard's apartment. By midnight, Peter had drunk enough to feel lightheaded, and the loud music inside the club started to give him a headache. Needing a break, he stepped outside to get some fresh air. He wandered into a nearby alley and sat down on the curb to catch his breath, unaware that his decision to leave the safety of his friends had just made him Reynhard's next target. Within minutes of observing from his window, Reynhard made his move, sitting beside Peter in the alley and striking up a conversation. He seemed friendly and approachable, telling Peter how he, too, had recently finished school. Their chat was casual and pleasant, with Reynhard putting the young graduate at ease. After about 10 minutes, Reynhard pretended to feel cold and suggested they continue talking in his nearby apartment. Peter, assuming there was no harm in it, thought he could call his friends once they were done partying, and they could pick him up from Reynhard's place. Once inside the apartment, Peter went to the bathroom to freshen up. When he returned, Reynhard offered him a drink, a clear liquid that tasted somewhat like vodka. Without thinking twice, Peter drank it. Within moments, dizziness and nausea overwhelmed him. The room spun uncontrollably, and Peter found it impossible to focus. He reached for his phone to text his friends and mom, but Reynhard quickly snatched it from his hands, suggesting Peter lie down for a bit to rest. Though Peter tried to stand and make his way toward the front door, his body failed. His strength drained, and he collapsed to the floor, falling into Reynhard's hands. As with all his previous victims, Reynhard wasted no time. He set up his cameras, adjusted the lighting, and prepared to carry out his horrific plan, intending to take advantage of Peter repeatedly throughout the night. 4 hours later, Peter regained consciousness, lying face down on the floor. His pants and underwear had been pulled down to his ankles, and Reynhard was attempting to assault him once again, but this time adrenaline surged through Peter's body. Fully alert and aware, he mustered the strength to push Reynhard away and stand up. Reynhard was stunned. None of his victims had ever regained consciousness so quickly. In a panic, he had no idea what to do and bolted out of the room. Meanwhile, Peter, still disoriented and unsure of what exactly had happened, quickly pulled up his pants and scrambled to gather his belongings. Just as he was about to leave, Reynhard reappeared, screaming at the top of his lungs in a frantic attempt to stop him. Reynhard, realizing the severity of the situation, began making as much noise as possible in a desperate attempt to make it seem like an intruder had broken into his apartment. He then lunged at Peter, headbutting him in the stomach and knocking him to the floor. In that moment, Peter understood that his life was in serious danger. He summoned all his remaining strength and began throwing punches in self-defense. A violent struggle broke out between the two, with Reynhard biting, kicking, and scratching in a frenzy. Despite his disoriented state, Peter managed to land a few strong blows, enough to push Reynhard off him. This gave him a fleeting chance to escape. Peter quickly gathered his belongings, including his phone, and made a dash for the front. Just as he reached it, Reynhard appeared out of nowhere, his desperation palpable. Reynhard fully grasped the gravity of the situation. If Peter escaped, he would go straight to the police, and everything Reynhard had been hiding would be exposed. He couldn't allow Peter to leave, so he clung to him with all his might, like a predator unwilling to let go of its prey. Peter could sense the seriousness of Reynhard's intentions, and fear surged through him. However, being a rugby player, Peter had a stronger, more athletic build than the much smaller Reynhard. Using his superior strength, he knocked Reynhard down with ease and began punching him with all his might. Fueled by adrenaline, Peter unleashed a series of blows until Reynhard lost consciousness. Realizing his attacker was no longer a threat, Peter quickly grabbed his things and fled the apartment, his heart racing. His first instinct was to call his mom to come and get him, desperate to leave this nightmare. But as he stepped into the hallway, a chilling thought crossed his mind. He just killed someone? Fearing the worst, Peter began knocking on his neighbors' doors, asking them to call emergency services since his phone had no battery left. The paramedics arrived quickly, and they found Peter covered in blood standing in the corridor. Shaken, he directed the medics to Reynhard's apartment, explaining that Reynhard had drugged him and violated him and that he had fought back in self-defense. When the medics entered the apartment, they found Reynhard still unconscious and in a bad state, the aftermath of the brutal fight. Reynhard lay in a pool of his own blood when the police arrived on the scene. Without hesitation, they arrested Peter for assault. Comparing the scene, an unconscious man lying on the floor and a well-built rugby player standing nearby, the officers assumed that Reynhard was the victim. Peter was immediately taken to the police station, while Reynhard, in critical condition, was rushed to the hospital. Fearing for his life, doctors were unsure if he would survive the night. The police, fully convinced of their assessment, didn't bother conducting any tests or further examinations. To them, it was clear-cut. Reynhard was the victim and Peter was the aggressor. They simply locked Peter in a cell, leaving him to sit there for 11 long hours, terrified that he might be charged with assault and unsure if Reynhard would survive the ordeal. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Reynhard's condition was severe. He was suspected of having a concussion and internal bleeding, but after a few hours, he regained consciousness and immediately spun a false story. He told the nurse that he had been attacked in his own apartment and had been sexually assaulted. The hospital staff, moved by sympathy, saw a young man battered and bruised and believed every word. Later, police officers arrived to question Reynhard about the incident. The first thing he asked for was his mobile phone, claiming he needed to contact his family and let them know he was okay. In reality, Reynhard's goal was to delete incriminating video files stored on the device. However, the police, following protocol, took the phone for examination as Peter had accused Reynhard of abuse. Although the detectives were initially inclined to believe Reinhard's version of events, they had to investigate. As a matter of formality, the officers asked Reinhard to unlock the phone, but when he repeatedly provided incorrect passcodes, suspicions began to arise. When Reinhard became increasingly agitated and even lunged at one of the officers in a desperate attempt to retrieve the phone, the police realized he was hiding something far more sinister than they initially suspected.